Hello, everybody, and welcome to Shaman Sister Sessions. My name is Michelle Hawk, and I'm here with my shaman sister, Katherine Bird, and we are so excited today to welcome Furkhan Dandia. He and I connected through a podcast project, and I was on his show called Easy Conversations. If you haven't checked that episode out yet, please make sure to do so. I've got it linked in my podcast library on my website. But we are so jazzed to talk with Furkhan today. I enjoyed our conversation so much, I invited him to be on our show. With over 20 years of experience in the corporate world, Furkhan recently pivoted to pursue a calling in the therapeutic space. Alongside his work in addiction counseling, anger management, and entrepreneurial support, he holds a master's in counseling psychology, and he is the host of the podcast Easy Conversations, which is focused on health and wellness. His approach to therapy is deeply rooted in the belief that true resilience and healing emerge when individuals connect with a deeper sense of meaning and purpose. He views adversity not as a barrier, but as a doorway to growth, an opportunity to cultivate gratitude, humility, and inner strength. He emphasizes spirituality as a core element in his work, helping clients move beyond surface-level concerns to find purpose in their experience and struggles. His goal is to guide individuals to recognize their their own resilience, even in the face of life's toughest challenges, and to live from a place of profound gratitude. He is here to share his insights today on how spirituality can be integrated into therapy, enabling individuals to navigate life's complexities with clarity and resilience. And I got to say, we love that. We love, yes, let's bring the different modalities and the different worlds together. Science and spirituality and clinical therapy, psychology. Furkhan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation and share as much as I can with your listeners today.
Awesome. Yeah, as much as we can do in less than an hour. There's so much more. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'd love to hear, how did you make that shift originally from your corporate world into your therapeutic calling?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest piece was when I was going through a divorce like 7 years ago. And therapy was something that I didn't really look upon as a resource that I can seek out. In fact, I had a very short-sighted view of therapy and fairly judgmental, that in the sense that if you're seeking out help, things have really gone bad or they're wrong. And as I was navigating that process of going through a separation, I started working with various therapists. My needs evolved over time. And I started working with many therapists until I landed on the one I've been working with for the last 5+ years. But that's where it really started. And what I started to realize for myself was there was so much shame around my experience, where I looked at myself as a failure rather than looking at it as an opportunity for growth when it came to the divorce. And then I started realizing that I can't be the only man who's going through this. And I felt this calling as you were introducing my work, in terms of how can I be an advocate for other men and be that, I don't know, light or lamppost that I needed when I felt lonely and isolated. And that started to evolve. And during the pandemic, I decided to apply for a master's and in counseling psychology, which I finished a little over a year ago. And that's where I'm now practicing. But it's all coming together slowly. I always like to refer to this quote from Rumi around, when you start walking on the way appears. And every day something new comes to the surface where I'm like, okay, I think this is what I'm meant to do. And who knows what the next few years will hold for me, but that's where I am today.
Amazing. That's so great. I think it's really what you're saying about kind of how we get into into our healing work, into therapy, all of these things. We often have these huge blocks and these beliefs about what it even means to get help, or what it means about us to get help. And it's one of those things that keeps people from doing anything, of getting help, asking for support. And especially in our society, especially men, have been conditioned that you shouldn't ask for support, that it means something if you need help. And then you just end up getting further and further into the depths of where it's harder and harder to ask for help and harder to get help. I'm curious, like, as you've been on this journey, especially helping men, what are you seeing as far as how do you get people, especially men, who have those beliefs and those misunderstandings about what it means to work on themselves, or what the work is, or why to do it? What are you seeing are the ways that you're able to reach? Like, what's the bridge piece? Because that feels like that's so important and so missing right now, is like we have this huge disconnect of people who really do need help, but they're either refusing help or they're getting help from really the wrong place, and they're like listening to podcasts and getting more toxic and more angry and more disconnected. So how do we do this? How do we build this bridge with people who are in that mindset?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Uh, there's so many ways of answering this question because there's so many layers to it. Excuse me. One of the things, I'm part of this networking group where we're talking about supporting men, and it's more in a therapeutic space. And one of the things we were talking about yesterday, very similar to your point, is there's so much misinformation out there, right? There's, you go on social media, there's everyone trying to define what a man is, how you can be a better man. And often it's more detrimental than actually serving. So one of the ways I think you can bridge that gap is just by showing up, demonstrating what healthy looks like, right? You're not going to stand there and preach. You have to demonstrate through your own actions. And it's something how I focus on in terms of parenting as well. I try to remind other parents, including myself, that children learn by watching, not by being told. So if I can lead by example, then that is one way of bridging the gap. Other areas are several years ago during the pandemic, I was attending men's groups virtually, and I saw a lot of value in that. So my friend and I here locally, we started a men's group, and people that needed it were finding us. So I think when you're out there seeking support, you can find it. And to your point, you may go down the wrong path, but you have to be really honest with yourself. And I think everyone's on their own journey as well, right? I know I was making tons of mistakes when I was going through the process of even separating and going through divorce. There's a lot of things I did that in hindsight I could have done differently, but I needed to go through that to learn and be where I am today. And I think a lot of men shy away from that failure, because it is in those moments where you learn the most. And the last piece, I think, is what I see with a lot of the men is they're often standing in their own way. And until, you can talk all the talk and say, yeah, I want a better life, I want to develop, I want to achieve my goals, but are you ready to make the hard changes? And I think that's what something Michelle and I talked about on my podcast too, is you have to let go of a lot of things and really experience that death when you're wanting to experience transformation. And a lot of people aren't ready to do that, and that's okay. There's no timeline to it. I think you really have to want it badly. And that's the point where I got to. So even though I was on paper doing all the right things, I was getting a degree in psychology, and I wanted to be a therapist, I was still making poor choices in my life. And I had to get to a point where I was like, okay, if I don't make changes now, I never will. But I had to get to that point. So I hope that answers your question. But there's, like I said, a lot to it.
There is a lot to it. Yeah. I think one of the pieces there around, it seems, a lot of times we maybe go to therapy, or we go to like try to approach healing from a place of we're trying to solve a problem, or we're trying to ease pain. Specifically, we're trying to create more comfort and feel comfortable again somehow, or maybe for the first time ever try to feel comfortable. And I think that we have a cultural misunderstanding that discomfort and pain is part of the growth journey. And that was one of the things that poked out to me in your kind of description of what you're up to, is like the opportunity in the discomfort and the pain. So I would love to hear just like a maybe a surprise that you've had on your journey about yourself, or about that realization that you were coming to when you were realizing like, oh, actually I have to orient myself in this different way around what my experience has been. Is there
Yeah,
something you can share with us about your journey?
yeah, I think it's constant, right? And I think that humility is so crucial because it's the polarities of it too, right? Like I feel like often I'm making all this progress and then boom, I'm dealing with this extremely challenging situation in my life. And I'm like, oh, well, there's my ego again, right? This is where I was getting high on myself. And I was thinking that now I can look down on people that look at me. I'm doing all this great work on myself, but I'm still making choices that aren't serving me. And by these choices, not only am I hurting myself, but others as well along the way. So that humility helps me reorient myself. And I, I mean, I can look back and pick out different points on in the last few years on my journey where that's happened. Most recently, it's around just being a father and that constant navigation of, okay, am I making choices because I think that's the right thing for my son, or in some way they're self-serving, right? Is my ego at play? And I have to be constantly asking myself. And some days I wish, I'm like, oh man, I wish I didn't have this much awareness so I could just kind of be on autopilot, because this is really hard, like to be so honest with myself and constantly reflecting and knowing that, okay, here's a choice I have to make and be a bigger person. And I think that's been the biggest thing I can say on that is being disciplined and accountable to myself, and knowing that if I'm not sticking to my daily practices, I can easily slip back. And it's like what I try to explain to other people too is, if I'm doing breathing exercises every day, non-negotiable, it's not because I'm doing it because I need it. I'm doing it because I'll have it when I actually need it. Right. So I think that's the biggest thing I can share on that. But it is a daily practice for sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Furkhan. Something that's coming up very strongly in my mind as we're talking about this is, you're mentioning the humility, and you're mentioning kind of that really kind of constant vigilance of self-awareness and reflection. And currently in the US in particular, we're having this big old socio-political shitstorm. And there's, Kat mentioned podcasts, and I'm just having so much more awareness than I ever used to about all the sources of information and all the sources and communities that serve as echo chambers to validate and amplify wounding and pain, and all of the like deeply sourced inner pain that then expresses as violence and bigotry, and all the political shitstorm that we're seeing now. And so I'm hearing, as you're reflecting on this, and Kat, great question about like how to bridge that to get people into therapy basically, or get people into that self-reflective space. And I'm just feeling so deeply that missing piece, like there's something missing for all the people who are instead like listening to Joe Rogan and listening to all these echo chambers of violence, that then rather than being in empathy and being in humility and recognizing like, wow, this is my pain that is mine, and it's my the potential of the potential of the medicine is there within the poison, right? But I need to be willing to go through that and be willing to be humble and be willing to be vulnerable. And it is very uncomfortable and inconvenient to do that. Or I can just go hook up with these guys over here and blab all the hate speech that I've internalized, right? And so it's this really interesting, like, feeling that so strongly, that missing piece. And, and so it's this, I feel just a lot of celebration for embracing humility, embracing that kind of constant awareness to come back to the devotion of a daily practice. And, like I tell my clients, you don't need to clean your bathroom every day, but if you only ever clean your bathroom once a year, it's going to be disgusting, right? Like, do it once a week, and then it'll be like the maintenance is there, so it never gets to be that disgusting, right? And the same is true of our inner toilet, right? Of like being in that process of kind of continual reflection makes sure, hopefully, that we never reach that crisis point where it erupts in crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to kind of piggyback off what you're saying, I think, unfortunately, what I'm also observing in the world is that we're so, and I'll kind of use a model that we use in the addiction side too, is we are so focused on everyone else's drama that we're not paying attention to the drama or the chaos that's brewing inside, because that is tough to face. So it's easy to focus on everyone else's dysfunction. But when we're able to ground ourselves and focus on the dysfunction we have internally, we can heal ourselves, right? Be more grounded, be more present. And then we can also influence others based on how we're showing up, right? So that was kind of how I was trying to answer Kat's question too, is if I'm grounded and I'm being more present and connected with myself, my energy is also influencing the people in my immediate surroundings. So whether or not they're able to pick up on that and do something with it, but at least they're feeling something that they're like, okay, maybe I want what this guy has. How do I get that? And then that curiosity comes in, right? But if I'm focused on trying to fix their dysfunction, then I'm not being honest with myself. And then it kind of goes back to the whole idea of how I approach parenting, right? I'm not being a good role model. And I think that's where we're lost is heal yourself, right? And as cliche as that might sound, if you can heal yourself, you can then start affecting others through your behaviors and how you're showing up.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to hear, you mentioned, this is a good segue into the meat of your therapeutic practice, and you mentioned addiction work. I'm particularly, one of the reasons I really wanted to invite you on here to talk with you is about the intersection and how you're weaving spirituality into your therapeutic practice, because I know that is definitely more emergent now in like clinical psychology, but previously I think about when and actually here I'll just tell a story here for a moment. And I believe I've mentioned this in previous podcast episodes, but in around 2013, 2014, I was in a really rough spot in my life. I was recovering from an abusive relationship, and I was having a lot of like, what the heck is going on? And I had this moment where I was like, do I need to go to therapy? And I was too afraid, not because of shame, not because of fear of judgment or being wrong, but because of my shamanic practice and because of my mediumship work and because I have such a strong connection to the spirit realm. And at that time, I was very active in my channeling and very active. And, of course I still am, but, it was very, very strong for me. And I was so afraid that I would go in and see a therapist and they'd be like, okay, she needs to be institutionalized. And I would be locked up. And so I never went to therapy because I was so afraid of having my spirituality be deemed as like be pathologized. And so I know that now, of course, I've got friends who are currently in school for their therapeutic practice and getting their master's in psychology, and they're talking about, oh no, my camera went out. Okay, they're talking about how it's so much more emergent in the curriculum, and so I know this is changing. So I'd love to hear, in your experience, both in your practice and in the therapeutic field, what are you seeing in that, and how does that show up for you in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's still a wide gap. And before we jumped on the recording, I was kind of mentioning that I think therapy became very secularized at one point, and the whole spiritual aspect and the concept of the soul, well, based on my observation and what I've read, was completely treated separately. There's a lot of scholars that talk about the psyche, but then the psyche then became a focus just on how we tend to behave in the exterior world, not really focusing on what's going on internally. And I still see that, like, a lot of therapists don't put a lot of focus on that because it's still very much the lens is on the behavioral side. And what I like about the clinic I work at in the addiction space is spirituality is a huge component, right? So they look at it from a biopsychosocial and spiritual perspective. So you need all four pillars. And one of the things models we talk about is the hierarchy of relationships. So starting with your relationship to your higher power, however you connect, there's no limitations or labeling around what that is. Most people are able to connect with the word God, and a lot of people aren't, and that's okay. Because I also believe people have significant trauma around the word God because of where they grew up, what their religious upbringing was, how they were treated by people in the name of religion. So that shows up for a lot of people, and that's part of their healing journey as well. But ultimately, it is that spiritual connection when it comes to the hierarchy of relationships. And the next fundamental part, which I don't think a lot of people appreciate, is relationship to self. And then from there, all the other relationships start stemming out, whether it's your romantic relationship with your family members. But those two are the most fundamental. And many people dispense with that. They immediately jump to their relationship with their partner or their parents, losing sight of the other side. And that's when people often then become disconnected. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, then you kind of swing from pleasure and pain, right? So anytime you're experiencing pain, you're either trying to escape or chase after whatever brings you pleasure, but that's fleeting, and you're caught in that cycle. And addiction, what I've really appreciated working in the space, manifests in many different ways. Traditionally, we only look at it in terms of substance abuse, but it could be in many, many forms. Work can be an addiction, right? Or exercising can be an addiction. So anything that is taking you out from that hierarchy of relationships where you're not connected to self or your higher power, you could argue you're chasing something. So that spiritual component then becomes equally important. Now, in private practice or working outside of the addiction clinic, many people need to, there's that transpersonal psychology model where many people need to get a better handle on the cognitive side of it, right? So what are some of these thought patterns and beliefs and traumas that are recurring? How do I deal with that? But once you've kind of managed that, then a lot of people get to the point where they're like, okay, what's next? What's my purpose in life? What's my why? And that's where I like that transpersonal psychology model, because then you can bridge in the spirituality. I firm believer, and I think a lot of historians in this field have talked about the two go hand in hand, the spiritual and the cognitive side. And you can't have one without the other. In the religious framework that I grew up in, which is Islam, there is a huge focus on not only do you have to master yourself, but you also have to master the relationship that you have with God. And I think that message gets lost a lot of the times. And this is where a lot of people have religious trauma, or even this sense of otherizing and hate that we tend to see in the world today, is because people are missing the point. But I don't know if that helps to answer the question. But the spiritual component is significant for sure in development of self.
Yeah, I think it's important to be having this conversation. I have a lot of clients that are therapists. So a lot of my clients and my students are therapists, and I've gotten to see how their relationship with their own spirituality, with energy and energy work, with somatic work, with these aspects, especially people who've been practicing for 10 plus years and didn't get what now is there are our new educational components to what's going on for therapists. But people who've been in practice for a while, I've seen their own internal both discomfort with the exploration of that for themselves, and then the like blossoming of their own personal experience where they start to connect the dots of their own therapeutic work, what they've experienced going to therapy and what they've experienced as a therapist, and they start to see that it just explodes in its potential for both their own personal transformation and impact on themselves and their growth, but then the way that they're working with clients almost immediately. And the interesting piece about how when you start to spark that within yourself, the people who are also wanting that just show up and they're like, here I am. And it's really interesting because I've had a lot of people say, I was kind of scared, kind of intimidated that if I shifted my work in this way, or if I started to evolve, excuse me, if I started to evolve spiritually and energetically and started to incorporate these things, what was going to happen with my therapeutic practice, and who was I going to become? And I've just seen people like have these really incredible transformations within self and then their practice immediately changing things significantly. So I love what you're saying here. And so I would
I do
love to.
want to add something
What's
on
that?
that because I do want to add something. You've touched on something very crucial there because if in my view, if you haven't been able to find that acceptance for yourself and this deeper connection with, again, however you want to look at it, for me, it's the connection to God, you're also putting your clients at risk because you can be spilling over a lot of your own projections and internal conflict onto your clients, right? So if your client is struggling with something on a personal level, could be a parental relationship, could be even them exploring their own spirituality. If you've got all this chaos built in that you haven't addressed, you may lead them down a different direction and you may not be serving them. So I think it's really important, that piece of not only having that framework of spirituality in your therapeutic practice, but also being very curious and exploring it for yourself. And because that can really dictate how you show up in the therapeutic space and what kind of therapeutic relationship you're building. So I just wanted to add that because that's something I've experienced myself. And again, when I was kind of having my own spiritual journey over the last few years, it was really important for me to have someone to talk to about it because that can also feel lonely at times.
Yeah. I want to just insert a little note here to our listeners. Kat and I have recorded at least 3 or 4 episodes about how to choose a shaman, how to choose a spiritual practitioner, all these questions to ask and also unconscious biases to be aware of. So Furkhan, I love that you brought that up. Same applies, how to choose a therapist, making sure that we're human, we have programming, we have beliefs, we have whatever the case may be. And I think, the idea that some people, some therapists, some practitioners that I've seen people post online about, oh, I go in as a completely neutral force. I'm like, no, you don't. Of course you don't. We're never totally neutral. So recognizing our, our own patterns and our own conditioning and our own beliefs, and how that may be impacting our clients, our students, our people, and really taking responsibility for that is so, so important. So please, if you are looking for a shaman practitioner, mentor, therapist, go refer back to Kat and my other episodes. I don't know off the top of my head what number they are, but go search through them, like how to choose a shaman, how to choose a mentor, because we talk about that a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you almost have to look at it, whoever you're wanting to work with, look at them as a guide, right? And sometimes the guide's purpose is to lead you on your journey to a certain point, and then they may hand you off to your next guide, right? So don't get too attached to that. Oh, this is my therapist or my shaman or my healer, and they're going to take me all the way. And that may not be the case. And then eventually you may get to the point where you're the guide for someone else, and that journey just continues, right? So I think just being mindful of that too, that we're all guiding each other, and sometimes we're limited on how far we can take people as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really important, is to recognize, and going back to what you mentioned earlier about being very honest with ourselves in that reflection, both as, we have a lot of people who tune into this show who are both practitioners offering either their healership skills, their therapy skills, their body work, or whatever the case may be. And then also people who are in their spiritual awakening, their healing journey themselves. So from both sides of that, being in that really honest inquiry about, as a practitioner, what is my zone of genius? What is the territory for which I am an expert guide that I can be really responsible for and be really be sharing my expertise with the world, and then being very honest with myself. Actually, where do I need to refer someone out? What is not my zone of genius? Where would it be irresponsible for me to try to guide anyone else? And then as a recipient, looking at, where do I need guidance right now? Okay, this is now my comfort zone. I've got it. Maybe I don't need to lean so hard into working on this area anymore. It's time for me to venture around the corner and go around the bend a little bit, and maybe I need a different support for that.
Yeah. And, you can only take somebody as far as you've gone yourself. And I think that, especially in terms of spirit and energy, somatic work, these things that are like, we're adding on to the layers of therapeutic modality and experience, that when we're willing to be open and to explore and to be also in our not knowingness of our own personal spiritual development and growth, and trying new things for ourselves, and being willing to not kind of get stuck. I think sometimes as practitioners, and I think kind of therapists might be sometimes even more easily kind of land in this place of like, I have this modality and I know how this works, and I know that I can use a CBT or something like this, and I can get these kinds of specific results. But there's an unknownness about incorporation of spirituality and asking these questions and helping people to find their own path, and not imposing your own personal will and beliefs on what, like, well, this is what I believe spiritually, so it must be what's true. And a lot of times spirituality has been put into that container where people are sort of have the, well, if this is what I believe, it must be true. And so there isn't a lot of room for other people's experience or expression. But when we're leading people spiritually, we have to be open to them finding out what they find out, what they believe. Like that in and of itself is sitting in the unknown with someone. So I think that can be, it just adds this layer of like, I'm not in control necessarily. I'm not in the knowingness of what exactly is going to happen, because I'm giving someone the opportunity to explore themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. It goes back to what I was talking about earlier too, is how grounded are you yourself, right? And one of the things I believe is if you're confident and grounded in the sense that your beliefs and spiritual connection feels right to you, then you don't necessarily feel the need to control other people's journey or their process or their beliefs, because then you're more open to the fact that anyone can have their own experience. It doesn't matter how they get there. Everyone's trying to figure it out on their own. And I think where you see a lot of that narrative around control or otherizing, this polarity where we tend to find ourselves in the world today, is because people themselves aren't sure about their beliefs, right? So I often look at that, right? When you see someone that's grounded and confident, they're happy where they are. They don't need to convince anyone else, because they just show up and they're content, and that's it. And that feels so positive to be around that type of energy. And I think that's how you build that connection through yourself and finding that way of being grounded. I think that's what it really comes down to. But it is definitely a lot of work, and going back to the whole notion of being honest with yourself.
This is reminding me of a Wisdom Council call that, Kat, you were on too, when there was a person there who is a university professor who works, generally teaches freshmen. And they were saying how they're inviting people at the students at the beginning of the course, or the beginning of the semester, I guess, to, they say, I don't care what you think, but I care that you know how to think, right? And they reported seeing just, a really small percentage of the incoming students, like 18-year-olds, who actually had an opinion and knew how to have an opinion rather than just reflecting whatever input of information they had received. And that was so shocking to me. It was so like, oh my gosh, really? This is what young people, and I would say, really beyond young people, this is just what the modern Western world has inundated us and saturated us with. Yes, there's more content than ever at our fingertips, and everybody has an opinion, and there's so much noise and input, and everybody listens to podcasts. Here we are. We have a podcast. We're sharing our opinions. Don't take, for all of you listening, do not take anything we're saying for granted. Run it through your own filter of discernment and have your own opinion about what we're sharing with you. And of course, this bears true for all inputs of information, to really, how do we be present with ourselves to digest and percolate on what we're taking in our philosophies, cognitively, spiritually, emotionally, relationally, and to not just take it for granted, but in order to digest it, to assimilate it, to reflect on it. And, Furkhan, what you said about like when we're solid in our own beliefs and our own opinions, like, there's a quote that says, the more you love your opinions, the less you need other people to love them. So when we're really stable in that sense of inner identity and inner knowing that comes from being able to be present with ourselves on all of those levels, with our higher self relationship, with our inner self relationship, with our external relationships, with our hearts, with our bodies, with all these pieces, it creates this very inviting and appealing stability that, like you said, people are just drawn to. It feels really good to be around. And we all know what that feels like. We've all been around somebody where it's just like, wow, how do I know what you know? How do I be how you be? It's so appealing and so attractive, I think, because it's becoming more rare to see in the world with all the noise. And so for all of you listening in, we're we're going to shift a little bit into like, okay, tools, recommendations, tips. And of course, Kat and I have so many podcast episodes for you to tune into about, well, how to be present with yourself, how to work with these spiritual practices. But Furkhan, I'd love to hear from you recommendations that you have for people to really do what we're talking about and come into that inner sense of knowing and stability and presence and humility, everything that we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, I think I mean, if you guys have previously talked about tools, I won't spend too much time on that. I can only speak to experience. So for me, this is what works. Every morning I will spend at least an hour and a half to 2 hours just being present with myself through various techniques before I even go and engage with the world. Because if I'm not grounded, or if I haven't dealt with whatever stressors I'm carrying from the day before, I'm going to tend to get hooked into the dysfunction. But if I'm grounded, then I can see the dysfunction for what it is and then have a choice on whether or not I want to engage with it or keep myself separated from it while still going out into this world and being a human, right? So, but yeah, I think for me personally, I'll do breath work, I will do cold exposure, I will do prayer, I will journal, and I would read something where, again, I am challenging myself both mentally and physically. And a lot of the times what I'm reading is to challenge my own worldview and belief system and to really test it out. And majority of the times I walk away feeling more enlightened that, okay, this is new information now that I can absorb and see how I can actually transform my belief system where it's more comprehensive or open to other ideas. So that sets me up nicely for how I then go out into the world and approach my day. But finding out what that is for you, and it's taken me months or years to figure out, okay, what is that sweet spot? And then there's a time where I find at times where I find certain things are no longer serving me. And again, going back to what you and I've talked about, Michelle, in the past, is that is part of the transformation too, that you need to constantly evolve and let go of things that are no longer serving you. So then it's getting curious, like, okay, well, is it not serving me just right now in this phase of my life, or is this just no longer serving me at all? What can I now add into my life? So experimenting, being very curious and honest with yourself. The biggest thing I would say, and this is something I struggle with on a day-to-day basis, is paying attention to when I am numbing out or seeking escape behaviors. It can be simple as when I'm on social media and just on autopilot. That is me being disconnected with myself. Okay, so what is it? Is there discomfort there? Are there emotions that are coming up or feelings that are coming up that I don't want to face? So then it's easier to avoid that and go do something else. And then before I know it, I've lost all this time. So being curious in those moments too, as to what's happening, where are these emotions coming from? And then the more you pay attention to them, the more awareness you gain. So I think those are some of the things that really help. And then for me, like I said, prayer is huge. Learning more about my own spirituality and why I'm here. And that is a regular, I would say, exploration, because things are evolving. Every day as I grow in different areas, I'm realizing, okay, there's more I can put, like more energy I can put into this space and serve a purpose, or pull some energy away from here because it's no longer serving anyone. So constantly exploring my why and what my purpose is, while being able to recognize how is my connection to my higher power. Is it feeling good? And on the days when it's not, again, getting curious, like, okay, what's coming up? What's the roadblock here? What's the hindrance? And how do I navigate that? I think that's something that's really helped me. Everyone is going to have obviously a unique experience. Everyone's spiritual journey is going to be very unique and independent, based on how you look at it. And at the same time, it's going to be something that you can define for yourself. I often reflect on a lot of the Eastern traditions where they talk about karmic agreements, right? So whether or not you believe in that, I don't necessarily, but the whole idea of it is very interesting to me, that we all have this agreement that we make. It's kind of in the non-secular or the monotheistic religions where there's this covenant that you promise you make with God. So again, we're all coming into this world to serve a purpose, getting curious with it. And I think another way people get disconnected is when they look at someone else and they want what they have, right? Or they're comparing their lives to other people. That can also be a trap. And you have to be authentic and honest with yourself in terms of where are you being called to.
Amazing. Those are all great, really good, really good little nuggets of wisdom of how to stay on the path. And it is often what you're saying is like just really calling your attention back, calling, like always looking like where is my attention right now? And where's my energy flowing right now? And is it flowing in a way that feels supportive of what I want to create and who I want to be? Or is it all over the place and distracted? And do I need to actually take even just a moment to recognize that that's what's going on, and then just intentionally bringing myself back to myself and creating that just as a regular practice in and of itself as something that's just sustaining? Because then once you bring that energy back and that attention back to self, then it's like, okay, well, if my attention and energy is actually here, what is there to explore? What's wanting attention, or what's feeling inspiring, or what do I feel like would be beneficial, like you're saying, to read or to contemplate, and not get lost in all this distraction that so many we're just lost in all the time, a lot of just much of the day, caretaking and sending our energy out to everybody but ourselves.
Yeah. Or what have we been avoiding confronting because we don't want to and we distract ourselves with other things. Furkhan, thank you so much for your wonderful wisdom and all of the beautiful things that you've shared with us today. I'm really, really happy that we get to have you here on the show, and I know that our audience will benefit from all of the wonderful resources that you had to offer and the perspective that you have to offer. I'm curious, where can people find you? Do you have any invitations for everybody that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, you talked about the podcast. So that's definitely an area where I like to share a lot of information through guests like yourself, Michelle. So Easy Conversations, you can find that on pretty much all the platforms. And then I do have a website if people want to learn more, where I do make reference. I do write a lot where I'm exploring these different ideas as well. I don't claim to have the answers. I'm always curious and learning more. So you can go to my website where you can find some of my writing. It's eunoiazen.com, so EUNOIAZEN.com. So you can find all of that. But that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll link in the show notes as well. So if you're listening, you just go find his links there. Furkhan, thank you so much. Do you have any closing words of wisdom before we sign off?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on and giving me the opportunity to share. I think I touched on it. The biggest piece would be just be curious, and there's no one way of finding that path, and do what feels right to you. And there's going to be a lot of detours and what may feel like dead ends, but that's all part of the journey, and it's all part of your growth. So it is at times easy to get discouraged or feel defeated that don't know what I'm doing, but we're all doing something, and the more honest you are about it and more curious you are, the easier it gets.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Furkhan. We are so happy to have you here. And Kat and I will take a moment and share what we've got coming up. Kat, do you have anything to invite people into?
Not really.
No? Okay. That's unusual. I feel like you always have things going on.
I mean, I always have things going on. If you want
Yeah.
to come and work with me, then do. I'm just not. I don't feel like selling anything today.
Okay. There you go. Great. I have alchemy apprenticeship is beginning in March. So I'm still taking applications for that. If you are called to go to spiritual grad school and learn both practical and like philosophical alchemy, then you can reach out to me through my website, michellehawk.com. And then, of course, I do offer one-on-one mentorship. And one of the, excuse me, speaking of being honest with ourselves and doing our inner reflection, etc., is something that I'm being very strongly called into, is to make a more formal school of shamanic studies and to offer the benefit of my over 20 years of study and practice in shamanism, multi-lineage shamanism. So that is something that I am currently in the process of birthing into the world. So stay tuned if that calls to you. In the meantime, though, reach out to me through michellehawk.com and make sure you get on my list to get all the updates as things are coming out and into the world. Okay, Furkhan, thank you so much. We'll put all your links in the show notes. So everybody, as you, I do really recommend going to listen to his podcast. I loved our episode. Like I said, that's why I invited him here. I was like, come on, let's talk more. And so and in, checking out his podcast, I was like, oh, this guy's good. He's got great conversations. He's always insightful, always beneficial. So please go check it out. And Furkhan, thank you so, so much. And always a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.